guys, gals, and those in between. Whether you like it or not, you must be dragged down to the terrifying depths of Silent Hill. Prepare to be spooked and sterilized with fear as we look back on this horror classic, just in time for the spooky season.
Sir, remember that scene this is like it.
What? What's that?
We're not supposed to get anything.
You're telling me Halloween's already over? You're also telling me by the time I finish this, Thanksgiving is probably gonna be over. Oh. Well, I suppose I got the spooky voice for nothing. Okay. Spooky voice. Off.
Yes, I wanted to get this video done by Halloween, but well, not much you can do. But spooks can happen all year round, or at least that's the excuse I'm using. And honestly, even though I captured this after Halloween, I was pleasantly surprised by how well this game has aged. To start off with, as usual, we'll get into development, and the legendary team behind it known as Team Silent. Doing some research, honestly, it's a miracle this game even got made. The legendary Team Silent, yes, the dream team of mythical status, were actually just cast-offs. The director of the game, Kiichiro Toyama, this was actually his first time on the directing chair. The more you look into it, the more it seems like the stars aligned for what should have been a failure. I called Team Silent cast-offs because they were put on the game precisely because they had failed in their previous projects. And this ragtag team actually intended to go and leave the company behind since they weren't allowed to achieve their ideal of what the game should be. Again, because this was literally Konami's island of misfit toys, series composer Akira Yamaoka had even stated they had a hard time just deciding on the game's direction. So forget the end, they hadn't even decided on the beginning. If you weren't aware of what Silent Hill would eventually become, and your only knowledge was just the info I'm providing, there's a good chance you'd be like, wow, this sounds like it's gonna be a train wreck. Konami itself, being more profit-driven, actually lost faith in the game, and the team themselves felt isolated with each passing day, and more like outsiders while making the game. Wow, Konami isolating a team and being a hostile work environment? That's new. I'm sure that won't show up. I'm positive it won't show up, I don't know, about 20 years later, and lead to a very public fallout with one of their most famous developers, and leave us consumers with a game that's never been finished? No way at all. No way that's possible. It's good to be delusional sometimes. Being outsiders, though, did have its benefits. With Konami basically not caring about them anymore, Team Silent had the artistic freedom to do what they wanted, without worry about someone lurking over them. Again, most of the team was going to jump ship after the game was finished anyway. So with the benefit of not being watched over, Team Silent decided to try their hand in psychological horror, and surrealism at that, opting to create a masterpiece instead of focusing on a profit-driven game. Back then and even now, everyone compared Silent Hill to Resident Evil, Konami's answer to Capcom's survival horror hits, and I just don't feel like that's a fair assessment. Maybe the higher-ups thought that, but Team Silent itself never seemed to think they were making something to rival another series, but to merely make their own vision. Resident Evil was always a more visceral experience, with an emphasis on monsters and hard-hitting action. It always reminded me more of a B-movie, with George Romero and slasher elements, with its emphasis on these horrid monsters and stalkers like the tyrants who chase you throughout the game. Silent Hill, meanwhile, seeks to scare you via the environment, to tense you up, question what you're hearing, what you're experiencing, and what is even happening. In Resident Evil, it's zombies, and in Silent Hill, it's, well, everything, and potentially nothing. So it's apples to oranges, and not quite fair to compare them. If Resident Evil is more a high-grade B-movie mixed with a slasher, Silent Hill is more like a thriller and a surrealist horror combined together. And that's to be expected from the inspirations. Silent Hill takes inspiration from a variety of sources, and really too much to say without bogging it down. So I'm just going to go through a few of the most prominent for brevity. Being made for an American audience, many famous writers like Lewis Carroll, Dean Koontz, and Stephen King are referenced. If not, some of their literary motifs are used for the game. The first street in the game is actually named Bachman Road, also known as King's pseudonym in the early 90s. Along with that, religion plays a big role in the overall world of Silent Hill. In a similar vein to King, the game showed the contradiction that companies those working to create a paradise on Earth and to help all of mankind are also capable of committing the most evil in pursuit of those deeds. The upper limits of the ends justify the means. The second major inspiration is from the Italian film genre known as giallos. Giallos are famous for being mysteries and thrillers with an emphasis on, well, mystery obviously, psychological thrills and psychological horror, along with psychedelics, with the most famous director of that genre being Dario Argento. Needless to say, these are all things that fit perfectly within the game. It doesn't seek to scare you with monsters, truth be told, while the design themselves are pretty good and the symbolism just gets better as the series goes on, most of these monsters reach to your knees. So without context, they're not that scary. I mean, look at these guys. I feel like most people just punt them. I think we all have that friend who's like, bro, I will completely whip Michael Myers' ass, know what I'm saying? I feel like here it's a valid option, because the monsters are more an obstacle than a scare. So instead of the frights coming from there, the game prioritizes the environment, the ambiance, and later entries of the game, what may be our own personal demons, how we are our own worst enemies, and create our own personal hells. Lastly, the biggest inspiration though was from the American film classic, Jacob's Ladder. One of the endings of the game is almost directly lifted from the film, though in the movie it's good, in the game it's bad. The fact that drugs play a big part of both making the player wonder is this really a bad trip that's going on, along with the hospital and subway in Silent Hill games. If you're a fan of Silent Hill, you might get a great kick out of Jacob's Ladder. The funny thing about all this is, remember how the director of the game had no experience? Well, Toyama, funny enough, also had no experience in horror. Yeah, he wasn't a die-hard fan or anything of it, but was rather a big fan of the occult, UFOs, and David Lynch films like Eraserhead, which was a perfect hit with the surrealism. So it wasn't like he was a total fish out of water, thankfully. Another way Silent Hill excelled would be in the sound department. Because what is great horror without great sound? Well, I would argue, not much to say the least. In horror, you can't have a traditional soundtrack, because the audio exists to add towards the ambiance, to heighten what's already there. It's the extra spice for the recipe, and now many cues are now ingrained into our memory from horror movies and games. Something as simple as Resident Evil as a zombie moaning alters whatever current state the player is in, to go from relaxed to being on edge. Silent Hill accomplishes this by using the radio that Harry finds early in the game. The radio is integral because it alerts you to incoming monsters. The harsher the static, the closer they are. So you can use it as a sort of barometer to gauge how close to danger you are. I found this pretty useful in closed off spaces where I could run, but slow down as the decibels of the radio increased. One of the best parts of the game was the sewers. Once you're in the ground, the radio is all but useless, and I didn't realize that at first. Even though it should be obvious because you're well in the ground, the signal can't get through. So because I was so used to that warning system, I kept running into enemies. The game took a system I relied on and turned it on its head, forcing me to go at a slower pace in its new surrounding, and to just hear for enemies' distinct cues. Some, like the air guys here, you can hear their flaps along with the static. So with the radio not working, I had to focus and pinpoint other minute noises that I might not have bothered trying to learn before. The radio is a bit like a double-edged sword, but with a dull end, because it alerts the monsters to your whereabouts so you can turn it off, but I never really needed to, so it's best to just leave it on. Along with the sound effects, series composer Akira Yamaoka wanted to craft a soundtrack that would go along with everything else in this beautiful and disjointed harmony, and boy did it work well. Akira opted to go with what can only be called a guttural and industrial soundtrack. As the game goes on, you hear moans, groans, and machinery. It works well because many times, even though I relied on the radio, just hearing these noises had me do a double take, hearing a groan and being like, did I miss an enemy, or was it just a soundtrack? Even though I was attuned to the radio, the game had me doubting myself. A prominent time was in one section with the windmills. It's similar to the sound of the creatures flapping its wings. So while running, I never felt safe. I felt like I had to keep running regardless if an enemy was there or not. Needless to say, there's a good reason why Akira Yamaoka is often cited when these games are talked about within the same breath, because he took what would be a good game and turned it, in my opinion, great. Coinciding with the sound, another great way that Silent Hill added to the immersion is with the rumble feature of the controller. See, with most other games of this genre, like say Resident Evil, since that's the most prominent example, when you're injured you see that externally. Your character being slower, holding their gut as they limp forward, having a hard time even holding onto their weapon. To contrast this, in Silent Hill, it's the player themselves who feel this. When you start getting lower health, the controller starts to rumble, akin to a beating heart. The lower the health, the faster the interval, like a dying heart desperately pumping blood to stay alive. It excels in keeping the player's attention. The only downside being is that it takes a bit for the controller to actually start shaking. So if you're playing on the harder difficulty, the swarm of enemies that appear will quickly overwhelm you. So much so, there were times where I died before I was given any warning at all. On the normal and lower difficulties though, it's a great experience. I'm pretty meh overall when it comes to the rumble features of games. Yeah, it was sold as this great thing to get immersed in the game, but usually it's little more than get hit controller shakes. So I always like it when games go above and beyond to try something new outside the box. Big props for that. Now all this would be for naught if the environment itself was boring. Thankfully, one of the best parts of Silent Hill is, well, Silent Hill. Taking place in said town in Maine, because yeah, as if Maine doesn't have enough horror, you got Pennywise and Susan Collins running around, now you toss Silent Hill into the mix, it's a miracle people still live there. Earlier I said Lewis Carroll was a huge inspiration, and this is more than in the puzzles that are references to his works, but how Wonderland seems to be a living, breathing thing, almost sentient. Many people remark it's almost a character in itself, and that's true of the town of Silent Hill. Throughout the game you'll shift from a fog world to a hell world, and routes will change on a whim. An area you can one-time access is now locked away. The town itself seems alive and guiding you towards your destination. I also really like this from a gameplay standpoint. In most video games, you don't start with endgame weapons like a rocket launcher because it's a game and it has to be balanced that way. Here it feels like the world is shaping itself around you rather than it was simply designed that way. When you find your first clue as to where you should head, you also find a steel pipe laying there, which is a much better weapon than your dinky little knife. Whenever you encounter tougher enemies or a new area, these new weapons feel like the town is giving you a fighting chance. The first boss of the game, if you look around, you actually read a story that gives a hint on how to fight the beast, just laying out in the open. This has made many people speculate that while the town is used by evil folks, the world itself is benevolent and seeks to actually help those it calls out to. The monsters themselves seem to be based on what haunts our subconscious. This is why enemies vary so greatly from game to game. The monsters here are based on a child's fear and other assortments from their imaginations. Bullies that torment look like demons that wield knives, their words and actions cutting to one's soul. Dogs that frighten might as well be Cerberus. This is expanded on in the sequels in creative ways, for the most part. Don't get me wrong, you don't make a ton of games without having a mistake here and there. And this is both good and bad in my opinion. It's good because it kept the overall fear factor up, but bad because in this game it's open-ended as to what's actually happening. So when it's revealed, some of that luster is lost. At the same time, it's unfair to judge a game for the directions the sequels take. So we have to judge what's here and not what it eventually becomes. So for now, just kind of toss the sequels out of your head and just focus on what we have now in front of us. Speaking of the world, let's transition to talking about the graphics of the game real quick. The character models themselves are quite good and hold up well, even the cutscene. Though they still have some of that early 3D cutscene feel. You know, the type where it's both loose and stiff somehow at the same time. We hadn't quite figured out how to make people move like people in 3D. Well, unless you got that Pixar money, that is. So for the time, even the cutscenes were pretty good. And truth be told, Silent Hill was a bit of a technical marvel, with it being the first fully 3D survival horror game. Most games that era used pre-rendered backgrounds, where an artist did the background and then inserted it into the game. That's because 3D is difficult. Even in games like Grand Theft Auto, I think we all did that thing where we went so fast, the game couldn't render itself fast enough, so you're just left in this void. Thus, most developers, depending on the project, stuck to pre-rendered, because it looked cleaner, and as the name implied, it was already pre-rendered when the game was loaded, so there was no outrunning it like in GTA. To put that into perspective, the first fully 3D Final Fantasy game I could recall was 12, which came out in 2006. So how did Silent Hill do it? Well, they used their weaknesses to their advantage. The draw distance problem? Well, there's fog for that. Besides adding to the chilling feel of the game, it also hides the fact that everything outside the fog isn't on the screen. As in, if the fog was removed, it would seem like there was just no world there. Full 3D at the time also just wasn't as good looking as pre-rendered, but this lower quality helps in many areas that look desolate and abandoned. This grainy look really helped makes the player feel like they're alone in this abandoned hellscape. The team wanted to make a masterpiece with limited resources, and I feel like they hit it out of the park for the most part. And now it comes to the aspect that I might give the least amount of praise, and that's the gameplay. Firstly, because the radio plays such a huge part, and I already explained most of it, and secondly, because it's clear that gameplay wasn't the focus of the game. There's enough positives to counter it. It's not terrible by any means, it's playable. It's more so that it was average when it was first released, and just hasn't aged well by today's standards. Besides the radio, you also get a flashlight to see in the dark, and in dark areas, if you don't have it on, you can't read your map. Sure, it can alert enemies, but without it, you can't see a darn thing. The map is one of my favorite touches of the game. Every time you encounter a roadblock or something of import, Harry marks it down. He's an active participant in achieving your end goals. And now for the negatives. Being a PlayStation survival horror, tank controls, welcome back. I didn't miss you and I seriously hope to never see you again. Yeah, you walk like a tank, all in a straight angle, no swerving. This makes avoiding some enemies darn near impossible. These flying guys right here, try as I might in all my playthroughs, they kept hitting me, over and over and over. Annoyances aside, you also get 3 guns, a handgun, a shotgun, and a hunting rifle, with ammo getting more rare with each interceding gun. Besides that, and the 2 earlier weapons I mentioned, you can also get a silver axe and an emergency hammer. With ammo, I was never sweating how much I had. Truth be told, so long as you play it smart, you don't gun down every enemy on the streets, attack the enemies that you can with melee weapons, you won't ever be in a pinch. Swing, back away, pull out the gun if there's more than one enemy, and you're good. Truth be told, there are more obstacles, as I said earlier. Even 2 of the 3 bosses come down to equip your strongest weapon, keep firing, heal as needed. The portion of the game fans remember most though is the puzzles. They're quite inventive. Like in the school, in the piano room, there's a memo that speaks of birds. And when you examine the piano there are keys obviously. So you have to equate birds to keys. Some of these puzzles I had to work my brain. And I advise you, if you play the game today, don't rely on an FAQ because it's so satisfying when you finally solve a puzzle. And as the series went on, they made harder difficulties for just the puzzles. People love them that much. That's really it on the gameplay department. Besides that, you do get some extra weapons for beating the game. You get a chainsaw, a rock drill, a katana, and if you get the UFO joke ending, the Konami Justifier, which was a real world item. If you have an OG PlayStation and the Konami Justifier, which was a light gun, and Silent Hill, an original copy, just plugging it in unlocks it and it comes with unlimited ammo. Though most of these are useless, and that's because when you beat the game and go on a New Game Plus, it automatically bumps the difficulty higher. With each ending, you can enter a secret menu to raise your bullet limit to 2x, 3x, etc. The problem is that on higher difficulties, the enemies gain so much health, these improved weapons are negligible. So honestly, if you're going to play the game more than once, easy mode is the best option, because hard is just let's toss more enemies there and have them absorb more hits. And again, combat is not this game's strongest suit. So the harder difficulty boils down to know which routes to take and which rooms to avoid. So your options are either A, knowing the game religiously, or B, trial and error, which was more annoying than fun on the harder difficulties, truth be told. Now it's time for the story. As usual, I'll put up a place where you can skip to if you don't want spoilers. If not, I'll give you some time to think about it. The story of Silent Hill starts somber. Harry Mason recently lost his wife, and his daughter Cheryl suggests they visit the tourist town of Silent Hill. While driving, they swerve to avoid a girl. Harry passes out and awakens to find that his daughter is gone. Chasing after her, you then shift into an otherworld, where you see a person flayed to the bone and put in a crucifix position. You're then jumped by some knife-wielding children and seem to, die. You then somehow awaken in a diner to see Sybil Bennett, a cop from the next town over. You explain you're looking for your daughter, and she gives you a gun because, stay strapped or get clapped. Finding a clue, you then head to the school, shifting once more into the other world. You fight the boss and pass out, having a dream of a girl who resembles Cheryl but much older. You then shift once more into the fog world. Hearing church bells, you go to investigate and meet Dolly Gillespie, another human who gives you a triangle and tells you to go to the hospital. With no other leads, and no matter how sketchy it sounds, you have to find your daughter, so you go to the hospital. There you see another human, Kaufman, or for some reason here they pronounce it Kaufman. I don't know, it just feels weird to me. Anyway, Kaufman sees you, clearly sees a person and not a monster, and shoots at you, so you say you're not a threat to him and then leaves. Pretty sketchy. The hospital also contains an item that affects what type of ending you can get. Along with that, it has my favorite transition. Going to the elevator, you go from floor to floor and realize you can't go anywhere. And then when you enter back, what's this? A 4th floor? That wasn't there before. Going up, you're now in the other world. You eventually work your way down and meet Lisa Garland, a nurse who's terrified of what's happening. Though before much can be said, you hear a siren and pass out. Again, seeing a dream of that same girl, but now walking into a door. Waking up in the original world, Dolly is there once again to berate you and drop a key to find the other church. Examining the key, you mark the address and head there to find Sybil. Giving each other updates, Harry hopes Sybil has at least a clue about Cheryl, and she does, learning that she saw a child walk across the water to another side of town, and that this town is actually a hub for illegal drugs, hence Sybil being there. Finding an altar with a puff of smoke, James awakens in the other world once more. With his only lead in this world, Lisa, you trek back to the hospital where she reveals the sewers can lead to the side of town where Cheryl was seen. The world starts shifting, forcing you to encounter a boss. Wreck him, you hear another siren and pass out, and you're in the fog world once more. Trekking to the original site, you break open the sewer door, which is actually hilarious. if you only have the knife, because you can actually just have the knife, you don't have to pick up all these other weapons, you can actually slash a lock with a knife. I don't know, I just find that hilarious, stabbing a lock till it opens. Like, that is the most impossible thing in this game, and I love it. After stabbing all the locks, you then arrive at the resort area, where you can do a side quest to save Kaufman, which affects the ending you receive. Going to the lighthouse, the world suddenly shifts once more, though this time there's no transition, there's no siren, and Harry notes how it's different, as if the worlds are now merging. Arriving at the boathouse, you see Sybil and Dahlia. Dahlia to basically berate you once more, while Sybil heads to the amusement park. You head to the lighthouse before heading to the amusement park yourself to see a possessed Sybil. And if you didn't get the item in the hospital, you have to fight and kill her. If you have the item, you can skip the fight, and then Harry reveals Cheryl isn't his real daughter. He and his wife found her on the side of the road and took her in. Regardless of whether you save Sybil or not, what happens next is you see that young girl again, she attacks you, that triangle that Dahlia gave you activates, trapping her, and Dahlia reveals that that young girl is Lessa. Seeing that you've been betrayed and it's made evident that Dahlia is up to something, you then head to the final dungeon to find your daughter and hopefully to find the answers behind everything that's happening. Now in a place called Nowhere, it's a mishmash of the school, the hospital, and it makes no sense in the best way. Some doors on the first floor transport you to the third floor. You then see Lisa again, where she learns she's actually an inhabitant of the other world. Pleading with Harry to counsel her, to not let her go, he runs as blood drips down her face and she cries. Returning to the room, we see that Lisa's gone, but her diary is now there. Reading it, we learn of a young nurse who wanted to leave this all behind, but had to attend to a dying girl who refused to pass on, and with Lisa herself being hooked on drugs, probably by Kaufman. She's probably one of the most tragic people here. Seeing visions of the past, you see the young girl Alessa on the hospital bed, with her mother telling others to keep her alive so they can bring back God. You'll see that Dahlia intended for her daughter to birth God, so that God could create a paradise, a world without suffering, even though she's literally turned the town to hell, and even helped with the drug trade, happily ruining lives for her end goal. Confronting her, she says the girl you've been seeing all this time in your visions is Cheryl, and that the wheelchair-bound girl is Alessa, and that they're both the same. Depending on if you save Kaufman, you either fight the incubator, a holy-looking being, it is supposed to be God after all, or the incubus, a demon. Either way, it destroys Dahlia, you destroy it. If Kaufman is still alive, Lisa ensures he cannot leave the other world, and you either get a baby from God basically, and you and Sybil raise it, if she lived, or are trapped in hell, or you find out this was all just a dying dream. So yeah, I can see why some people couldn't get behind this game. There aren't a lot of connecting dots, and the ones that are go a little bit like this. Find your daughter. Oh, your daughter's this girl. Also, that girl and this girl is the same girl. Also, we're gonna give birth to God. Also, drugs are involved. Also, now you're boxing God. Also, God has allergies, maybe. Don't really remember that in the Bible. Maybe that's the Old Testament. And now you're dead. And if you're not dead, then God's like, hey, here's a baby that's a younger version of me. Needless to say, if you didn't know about the Kaufman quest or the red liquid in the hospital, this would be the ending you get. So many players in their first time through got the worst ending, which was a dying dream. And I can see how that can be a letdown, and the game doesn't overtly tell you how to achieve a better ending. But I feel like the game does drop hints. The Kaufman quest is easy enough to initiate. You find him in a bar, you find his wallet, which leads to point till you find a red liquid, which he tosses at the incubator, which it's allergic to. So put two and two together. During your next playthrough, you see the red liquid in the hospital and you know it affects those from the other world. So you use it to save Sybil. It isn't overtly told, but it also isn't a large leap of faith either. I feel like with what the game shows you, a bit of thinking is all that's required on the player's part. As for what happened here and what the canon ending is, again, with time it's been revealed, but during the release of the game we had no idea. You find a book that says, this white smoke causes hallucinations, a white smoke you saw at the other church. Harry even comments that maybe he's in a hospital and this is all deep, just a dream he's having after the accident. What bits of story we get is that there's a religious order. Alessa was a young girl of power. Bullied and hating the idea of birthing God and doing evil to create paradise, she emulated herself and splits her soul in half. The baby Harry found being half of her soul. But Dahlia knew that she would reach out, both halves of the soul seeking to connect together. So Cheryl's visit to Silent Hill after her mother's death was that calling to become whole again. The fog and otherworld are manifestations of Alessa's mind, her fears and the things she's enjoyed. That's why through most of the game, when you transition to the Hell world, there actually is a transition like a siren or going through an elevator, and near the end, when her soul is merging, the worlds are merging. The reason Kaufman shoots at you is because he's the drug kingpin, and you find memos he's used his medical expertise to kill those on his trail, leaving no evidence. So he shot at Harry because he has a list of enemies who are out for revenge. To wrap it up, the baby is the reincarnation of Alessa, so that she can have a happy childhood, and that child eventually becomes the protagonist of Part 3. That kind of wraps up everything on Silent Hill. Is it still worth playing today? Well, if you've been watching this video, the answer is pretty obvious. There are some things that haven't aged well, mainly the controls and pushing you into higher difficulties on some modes. Overall though, it's still a pretty good experience. It still in the middle of the night gave me quite a few scares. My only real complaints are that the controls haven't aged well, because well, when it comes to tank controls, that's usually the case 9 times out of 10. Along with that, some of the mystery of Silent Hill is now gone, so some of that luster, that allure, has been wiped away when that puzzle piece is slowly solved. But there's a lot here that can be enjoyed. It's pretty widely available on the PlayStation Network, so give it a shot. Maybe it'll inspire you to try out the rest of the series that I love so much. Anyways, enjoy your holidays, guys, gals, and those in between. Hope you enjoyed this video and have a great rest of your day. If you like this video, then well, like it. You can also subscribe to me, you can comment, you can follow me on my socials, donate to my Patreon, and more. If not, hey, I'm just happy you went and enjoyed this video. Stay blessed.